Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. 1 Thessalonians 5:11. This is what my podcast is about: building each other up, putting bridges in relationships and creativity that will help us come together and support one another on this journey of life. Well, hey everyone, my name is Andrew Geist. Welcome to Anything Goes, a Journey Home, the podcast. I'm so glad to be here with you today. So what is a bridge? Well, a bridge connects two sides to each other. I mean, think about the Golden Gate. It connects one side of the harbor to the other side of the harbor. Think about other bridges. Sometimes they connect you from one freeway to another, perhaps across water. I mean, most of the time it's across water, if we're being honest with ourselves. And sometimes it's across creeks. It's sometimes across, you name the chasm that has to be crossed, because, I mean, that's another thing that bridges do, right? They span distances that seem impossible to cross. The truth is especially in San Francisco, before the Golden Gate Bridge, if you wanted to travel to one side of the actual port, you would actually have to go all the way around that whole Gulf section inside of the Golden Gate Cove there. And the same is true of even the Gulf Coast. I mean, we actually don't currently have a bridge that could cross the whole of Florida all the way down to the bottom edge of Mexico into South America. But should you imagine a bridge crossing such a great distance? That would be incredible. At the same time, a bridge functions as a means of decreasing the time it takes to arrive at the destination that you're attempting to cross to. Think about that. Before the Golden Gate Bridge existed in that space, you had to travel a long distance. Now it takes you minutes, where it might have taken you multiple minutes to even hours to get from one side of the coastal area or the cove area of the Golden Gate to the other. So what does that look like in our relationships, our marriages, our work lives? Well, maybe it looks like us taking the time to actually empathize with our spouses, or taking the time to stop ourselves from immediately reacting to something our friends have said to us that maybe hurt our feelings. Or maybe in our work life, it's actually taking the time to take notes on directions that are given to you by your supervisors, or being diligent about the way you communicate to those that are under your purview when it comes to you leading them. What does it look like? What does a bridge look like when we collaborate in these kinds of relationship settings? Well, collaboration is where, much like the Golden Gate Bridge, where they started building on one side and then started building on the other side, and they kind of met in the middle to connect both sides. The reality is that in collaboration in our relationships, ideally, that's what we should be doing. The bridge that we should be building is one in which maybe both spouses pause to listen to what the other person thinks. Maybe in the workplace environment, both boss and employee are both taking notes and making sure that they understand each other as they're communicating. And what does our efforts in building this bridge in these types of relationship settings facilitate connection-wise? As I said earlier, a bridge decreases the time it takes to arrive at a destination. And in relationships, what is our destination? Equitability and peace between both parties, ideally. Now, can that be always achieved? No, of course not. And in the context of a boss to employee situation, sometimes that peace is not always the case, because one is in authority and the other isn't. Nevertheless, the two should facilitate a bridge and a connection between each other so that both feel a mutual respect as well as a confidence that they're both heading towards the same goal, which is hopefully crossing that bridge and arriving at the destination either together or one ahead of the other, perhaps. Nevertheless, it's so important in our relationships to build these connections. So let's talk about this more. So first off, a bridge connects two sides. In every relationship, there's two sides, right? There is the employee and the supervisor. There is the husband and the wife. There is a child and their parent. There is grandparent to grandchild. There are so many variations of two sides to this relationship, and each requires a type of connection to each other. Now, we've seen what bridges can do, but we've also seen how bridges can fail when they are not built properly. The best bridges and the ones that have stood the longest, especially like the seventh wonder of the world, or among the seven wonders of the world, is the Golden Gate Bridge. Here's a bridge that stands above a vast expanse across a coastal entry. And it's one in which both sides had to be worked on until they met in the middle. And that's something truly amazing. And now, that's not how all bridges come to be. And that's not necessarily an indicator of how every bridge should be built. In fact, there are other circumstances in which other bridges built with different materials required a much different approach. Like the London Bridge in Arizona might have been designed more with the arches in mind, because that would have required all of that to be built first before the actual leveling of the bridge could be finalized. Among many other variations of bridges that are out there, you understand what I'm talking about. Just like the two sides to each relationship that we have and each connection point we have with these relationships, it's going to require of us a different kind of bridge and different kind of approach to how we build that bridge. How I talk to my boss at my work is not how I talk to my wife at home. How I talk to my children is not how I talk with my wife. How I talk to my own father versus how I talk to my brothers is also a very different thing. And each one of these relationships has required of me that I use different methods and building techniques in creating and facilitating those connections between each of us. That is why the human experience and relationships are so complicated. But that's why thinking about how we go about communicating with one another in the terms of building a bridge is a wonderful idea, because building bridges, if you look at how they've been built, they've never been built alone. They've been built by groups. Even thousands of individuals have come together with one sole goal in mind to build this bridge so that we could cross an insurmountable gap that's in front of us that we didn't think was possible until we did this together. Could you imagine if we actually approached how we talk to one another, how we communicate with one another with that kind of intentionality, just on an individual basis of an understanding that I'm bringing something to the table, this person's bringing something to the table, and we are going to build this together. Most marriages, that's the goal. My wife and I have been working on that for 10 years, and both of us will agree. Sometimes we've slipped up. Sometimes we've missed some joints. Sometimes we've missed some intentional moments where we could have communicated better, where we could have been more intentional in our bridge building to facilitate that connection with one another. But we both agree that it is not either one of ours fault for our failings, but it is a group effort. And as a group, it is our responsibility to come to both sides and help each other out when the other person fails. Another thing I talked about is a bridge spans distances that seem impossible to cross. The reality is that in this world and the relationships that are around us, just from a geopolitical landscape, it seems like there are so many places and people where it seems so insurmountable and impossible that we could relationally cross the bridge and come together and work together. It seems virtually impossible that we might see peace in certain areas. It seems almost impossible that we could come together and see the world become a better place because of us coming together. So that is virtually true for individual relationships as well. Let's face it, we're pretty selfish as individuals. We look to ourselves, our needs, our wants. We seem to be in social media culture these days being unbelievably focused on self and obsessed with, I have to look my best, I have to be my best, and I have to have something to give and sell to somebody else out there so that I can make my scratch, so that I can gain something in this world. Or I need to become famous, or I need to get my message out there as quickly and as fast as possible. And yet, the people that I'm talking to right now are so far away from me. But they might also be sitting right next to me, or they might be sitting in the next room. And yet we're so focused on ourselves, we become kind of islands to ourselves. We believe we have control over our lives, that we don't need anybody else. We don't need any other relationships. Kind of defeats the purpose when we're talking about work culture relationships. We're kind of on the same team. We're all reaching the same goal. We're all shooting for the same star. Nevertheless, the gap between those relationships seems insurmountable and impossible to cross, which is why it is so important for us to be intentional about creating those connection points, coming together, regardless of what side we come on, understanding that we may not always agree on the approach. We may not always agree on the technique we're using to facilitate the connection between someone and ourselves. But that's okay, as long as the same goal is in mind, which is building that bridge and connection between each other so that we can have a dialogue and eventually reach that goal, which is an equitable relationship where nobody feels like somebody's won and somebody has lost. That's not how relationships should work. Relationships are meant to be shared, meant to be encouraging, meant to build each other up. That's how God intended it to be. Again, 1 Thessalonians 5:11 says, "Therefore encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing." Paul wrote this to the church of Thessalonia because he was actually commending them for doing something well. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of Paul's letters tend to critique and criticize most of the churches that he's established, largely because, let's face it, we're humans, we fail. And Paul set up these churches to be successful, but then they kind of did their own thing, went about the faith and the gospel and beliefs and kind of got exposed to lies and things that Paul didn't actually teach them. So he wrote some letters to encourage them and tell them, hey, remember that thing I taught you? Paul was very intentional about building relationships with people, building those bridges between himself when he might be on another part of the world from the church that he was actually writing this letter to. It's pretty incredible how intentional he was with these churches and trying to help them be the best possible Christians that they could be. And that's why I'm making this podcast. Whoever you are, wherever you are, however you're listening to this and consuming this, I hope that this facilitates some kind of connection from me to you, that A, you don't feel alone, that you feel encouraged, that you realize there is somebody else out there who's thinking about the same things you are, who's wondering, how do I go about this life journey well? How do I go about this Christian life journey well? How do I do faith as a husband? How do I do faith as a spouse? How do I do faith as you fill in the blank? Because the truth is that my hope is that some of what I'm sharing you can use. I know that it's not a one size fits all. I know that it's not going to work for everybody, but at a minimum, I hope that you're encouraged and that you get a semblance of hope. That's the impossible distance that I'm hoping to cross with this podcast. The other thing a bridge does is it connects two destinations and decreases the length of time it takes to arrive at that destination. And if we're really being intentional about building this relationship with one another, we have to be willing to understand that the destination is the goal. We have to be willing to let aside and set aside all of our preconceived notions about how we should build the bridge and how it should get us to our destination. No, we should be focused on the goal of we just need to create a connection here so that we can go from point A to point B. And sometimes that's going to come with sacrifices. And hopefully those sacrifices are not detrimental to the overall construction of the bridge. I think I've used the bridge analogy enough because the truth is with all analogies, it eventually starts to fall apart. But I think you get my point when I talk about the fact that when we're facilitating connection between the relationships that we have with ourselves, the goal for us is to arrive at the destination as quickly as possible. And the only way that we can do that is being willing to be humble enough to say, you know what? That's not how I would go about doing this in this relationship, but you know what? I'm willing to try. I'm willing to give it a shot because I care about this person enough. I respect this person enough. I trust this person enough. In the context of my job, that comes up quite a bit because in creativity and especially music, there are a lot of different approaches and there are a lot of different people that go about it in very different ways. Some people do it by ear. Some people do it by rote. Some people fall somewhere in the middle between there. I'm kind of in the middle and I tend to be more by rote. And so it is always challenging to me when my boss encourages me to think outside the box, to be more feeling about the music and less thinking about the music. It's not natural for me, I have to admit. But when I do engage with it and I take my brain out of it, some of my best writing has come from those moments. Some of my best performances have come from those moments. I'll never forget a moment in my life where I was singing a particular song that truthfully didn't really fit my vocal style. It was hard and I struggled a lot. And a friend of mine came up to me and she was infinitely better at this kind of music than I was. And she told me, you know, Andrew, you're not very good at singing this style of music. She was a blunt person, but I understood what she meant. And I was in a place where I could receive that criticism fairly well because I was struggling. But she told me one of her tricks to doing the songs like that well was to think of it this way. She said, never do the same thing twice. And I got to thinking, man, it's so simple. And I started to practice it. I started to replicate it. I started to realize, oh, if I simply don't engage in the process that I used to engage in, I'm going to see more success with this kind of music, this style of music. And as I did that, I did. In fact, it led to some great successes to the point that my choir director trusted in me more significantly when those songs came about. And the other cool thing was I got to sing with this friend of mine, which I loved singing with often. That's an example of how we can facilitate connections with one another if we're willing to humble ourselves and set aside our pride and be willing to admit that, I'm not so good at this kind of communication and connection making with people, but I'm really good at this. What would it look like if I applied myself to the things that I struggle with in relationships and connections to the things that I'm not so good at? What would it look like if I took the good things that I am at in relationships versus what I'm bad at and just avoiding it, which is what we tend to do. We tend to say, I'm really not good at communicating with my wife, so I'm just going to listen. Or I'm not good at dealing with conflict, so I'm going to just write an email. Or I'm going to write a text. And I think you know where I'm heading with this. What happens? Everything falls apart sometimes because we can't infer tone from texts or emails. And if we just avoid conflict and we avoid these situations, nothing gets accomplished and people still feel unheard, hurt, and that impossible gap exists and continues to exist. So let's ask ourselves, how can we build a connection between the people in our lives? Whether it's work, whether it's family, whether it's our spouse, whether it's at home, whether it's with extended family or friends, what are some ways that we can facilitate better connections and be more intentional in the way that we build bridges between our relationships? So I want you to do something for me. What would it look like to serve someone else's creativity? For that matter, what would it look like if you served somebody else's method for communication? What would it look like if you communicated on the terms of the person you're communicating with? What bridges would you need to build? What existing bridges might you need to destroy? What ways might you need to create and facilitate a type of collaboration in your relationships, whether at work, at home, with your wife, with your kids, with your siblings? What kind of connections are missing? Take a moment this week to think about how you could submit to somebody else's method of building bridges in relationships. My name is Andrew Geis. Thanks for listening to the podcast today, for liking and sharing. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you can get notified every time I take a journey home. You can also go to A Geis Production to connect with me there. You can also find all the previous seasons and episodes from this show at ajourneyhome.blog. Don't forget to check out the socials below and in the show notes, as well as links to my merch store and more. Be kind to each other, show faith, love, and hope to those who need it. Have a great day. I'm going home.